In this example, we're going to be looking at adding rational numbers, and more specifically, adding fractions. So a couple things we have to remember before we start adding our fractions. When we add or subtract fractions, we need to have a common denominator, and that means that the bottom part of the fraction has to be the same. One way to get a common denominator is by multiplying the denominators that you have. So I could figure out a common denominator between a -2/7 and 3 over a -5 by just multiplying 7 times a -5. So that is one way that we could figure out what our common denominator is. Another method you could use to find a common denominator is you could list multiples of the denominators. We're not going to get into that right now because this one here does give us our least common denominator. It's also important to realize that a fraction, a negative fraction, can be written multiple ways. So let's say we had a -1/2. Well, that could be the same as -1 over 2, or the same as 1 over -2. If we ever end up with a fraction where we have a -1 over a -2, so a negative over a negative, that actually gives us a positive 1/2. So these here are two things to remember while we're dealing with signs, because this is something new here. We're used to dealing with fractions without negatives. Now that we're dealing with the negative signs, these are two important things to keep note of. Now for our problem here, we have a -2 over 7 plus 3 over a -5. Because the bottom of our fraction is going to be the same, I'm going to write everything on top that we need to add, and I'm going to keep the bottom what it should be. And we know that the bottom here is going to be 7 times -5. And to figure out what the top is, we could cross multiply. So we can multiply -2 by -5 to give us a +10, plus 3 times 7 to give us 21. If we were to simplify this fraction now, we would add the top together. 10 and 21 gives us 31. And 7 times a -5 gives us a -35. So we have one positive and one negative, which means this is a negative fraction. So the answer to -2 over 7 plus 3 over -5 would be a -31/35. Another method that we could use with this problem, we could get the negatives, or we could rewrite it with the negatives on top. So I'm going to rewrite this as -2 over 7 plus, instead of having 3 over -5, I'm going to put it as a -3 over 5. And we apply the same process here. 7 times 5 gives us 35 on the bottom. If I multiply diagonally, a -2 times 5 gives us -10. Our symbol is addition, so that's plus. And then -3 times 7 gives us a -21. When we add across the top, we end up with a -31 over 35, which is the same as -31/35. For the next example, we're adding up mixed numbers. So we had 1 2/3 plus a -2 1/6. One method that we could use for this problem, we could split up the fractions, and then we're going to add the integers together, and then we're going to add the fractions together. So by splitting up the fractions, here's what I mean. I'm going to take 1 2/3, and I'm going to rewrite that as 1 plus 2/3. it was addition, so I'm going to bring down the addition sign. And now I'm going to separate the negative 2 and 1/6. A big thing to understand with the negative 2 and 1/6 is that both parts are negative. So negative 2 and 1/6 does not equal negative 2 plus 1/6. Negative 2 and 1/6 equals negative 2 plus a negative 1/6. It's important to understand when you're splitting up a negative mixed number that all parts are negative. It's not just the first number that's negative, the fraction is also negative. So splitting this up, I'm going to write this as a negative 2 plus a negative 1/6. So now we have an addition problem with 4 different parts. I'm going to rewrite it so that the integers are together. So we have 1 plus negative 2 plus 2/3 plus a negative 1/6. And we can now do this in parts. This first part here, 1 plus negative 2. 1 plus negative 2 leaves us with a negative 1. And for this here, the fractional part, we're going to follow the example that we just used. So 3 times 6 on bottom, that would give us 18. And then we cross multiply. 2 times 6, that gives us 12. Plus, this is a negative 1. We're going to put that negative 1 up front there with that 1. Negative 1 times 3 is a negative 3. So now we're left with a negative 1 plus this over here. We could rewrite that as negative 1 plus 12 plus negative 3 leaves us with 9/18, which is 1/2. Now a common mistake here is we would just combine this negative 1 and this 1/2 to make it a negative 1 and 1/2. But what we have to realize is that the signs are different. We have a negative 1 here and a positive 1/2 here. So the signs are different, so we actually have to subtract there. By subtracting this, by subtracting 1 minus 1/2 leaves us with a negative 1/2 as our answer. Another method that we could use to solve this is we could change these mixed numbers into improper fractions. So we had 1 and 2/3, and to rewrite that, we multiply 3 times 1, which is 3, and then add the 2. So 3 times 1 is 3, plus 2 gives us 5/3. And then if we want to rewrite the negative 2 and 1/6, 6 times 2 is 12, plus 1 gives us 13. So that is a negative 13/6. So now we could rewrite our problem as 5/3 plus a negative 13/6. And again, to find our common denominator, we could use our least common denominator in this situation. We don't have to multiply 3 by 16 or 3 by 6, but since we've been using that method, we're going to stick with it. So 3 times 6 on bottom would be 18. 5 times 6 is 30, plus 3 times a negative 13 is a negative 39. When we add the top together, the signs are different, so we need to subtract. We're left with a negative 9/18, which would reduce to a negative 1/2. So it's the same answer, different method. Whatever method you prefer to use is fine. If you find one easier than the other, then stick with the one that you find easiest to use. For our last example here, we have three fractions that we're adding together. So we have 2/5 plus a -4 over 15 plus 1/10. And for this example, we're going to try and find a common denominator between all three fractions first. So to do that, I'm going to find the least common, and I'm going to start listing multiples of 5. We have 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. We'll stop there. For 15, we have 15 and 30. We could stop there, and we should notice that 10 goes into both 30s there. We have 10, 20, 30. So our least common multiple is going to be 30. So on the bottom of the fraction, we will have 30. Now to get our tops, we want to see how many times these denominators went into that number. So we know that 5 goes into 30 6 times. So I need to multiply this 2 by 6. So to figure out what the top is going to be for that, 6 times 2 gives us 12. Plus 15 goes into 30 twice. 2 times that -4 is a -8. Plus, and 10 goes into 30 3 times. 3 times 1 is 3. So on top, we could simplify this expression. I'm going to add the 12 and the 3 to get us 15. 15 and a -8 gives us a positive 7 over 30. So this would simplify to 7/30.